and welcome to episode 85 of the Space Policy Show, Charting the Risks, NASA for the 21st Century. I'm your host, Jordan Bingham. Today, we are pleased to talk to Dr. Patricia Sanders, Chair of NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, about the recent 2021 annual report to Congress. Dr. Angie Bukley of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and Jeff Hanley, GM of Aerospace's Human Exploration and Spaceflight Division, will be asking questions on the report's recommendations and what it could mean for NASA's future. Let's get started. Over to you, Angie.
Thank you, Jordan, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Patricia Sanders and Jeff Hanley here with us today. Dr. Sanders, welcome.
It's good to be here.
Jeff, glad you could join us today.
Glad to be here. Look forward to the discussion.
Great. Me too. So, it truly is our pleasure to have Dr. Sanders with us today to discuss the 2021 annual report from the NASA Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, or ASAP, that you chair. As a bit of background for our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with the ASAP, this report was submitted to Congress and to NASA on the 1st of January of 2022. It highlights some of the issues and concerns that the advisory panel discovered during the work they were doing in 2021. These issues, concerns, and recommendations that are in the report are based on a lot of research activities executed by the panel, including fact-finding and quarterly public meetings that ASAP convened, insight visits and meetings, direct observations of the decision-making and operations processes at NASA, discussions with numerous NASA personnel and contractors, and of course, most important part, the expertise of the panel members. So Dr. Sanders, let's talk about the evolution you see in the way that NASA manages human spaceflight programs, and specifically as it relates to NASA's charter and law, that is the Space Act of 1958.
Yes, a lot has happened since NASA was chartered on the 1st of October of 1958. They've had a lot of achievements, a lot of remarkable accomplishments. They've had some notable failures in a few cases, and but the world has evolved a lot since then. The world of space. Originally, NASA was sort of it. They were the sole driver and customer on behalf of the U.S. government and the nation, for the large part of the world. They were responsible for defining, directing, executing, and operating a space program and all of its major programs. They had a singular, consistent charter to go to get the first man on the moon, and then expanded from that. But a lot has changed. The missions that NASA is now initiating to go to the moon and Mars are significantly more complex than the objectives of the first forays. They're increasingly complex in ways that drives a lot of more focused systems engineering. They are looking at sustained lunar and Martian missions, which will involve greater risk than the operations that they've had for the last 20 years in low Earth orbit on the space station. The pace of technologies has increased incredibly, and they have to be agile enough and flexible enough to incorporate new advancements that would prove beneficial to their programs. The aerospace industry has evolved and is much more diverse and innovative than it was originally. And the companies are now both able and willing to be major participants. And the international community has seen the advantage of working with NASA on the space station and is increasingly interested in being a partner in some of the future space explorations. None of this really changes what was in the charter in 1958. They're still responsible for the expansion of human knowledge, although maybe not solely as responsible as before. They're responsible for improving usefulness, performance, and speed of space craft. They need to be responsible for sharing their discoveries with national defense. They still need to cooperate with other nations, and they still need to avoid unnecessary duplication of resources with the other agencies. But all of those things still hold true. That has not changed fundamentally.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that missions are becoming more complex. We need only, look at the Artemis program to see that, with so many things involved. With this evolution, has there been any specific impact on safety and mission assurance? Are there any implications or future implications to NASA's role and function as we go forward?
We as our panel believes there's a major shift, that this is a real inflection point for what needs to go forward in the future. NASA has been adapting. They've been adapting as they go to this changing environment in which they operate. They have tactically, taken on an emerging role. You could see this in the commercial resupply system for the space station, in the commercial crew program, where they didn't own, in both cases, the design or the hardware itself, but they did still own all the requirements and all the accountability for the success of the missions. So it is time, we felt, that for NASA to step back strategically and actually take a look at some fundamental questions. And those fundamental questions are, what is it that NASA intends to do in the future? And going forward, what is their piece and role in as a leadership in this? And how will they interact with these commercial partners in the international community? How will they work on the shared risk proposition? Because now they remain accountable, but there's other players that play a part in the risk, and that needs to be very, very clear. They have the benefits that they can draw on industry that's building capabilities, development capabilities for more than one customer. So NASA doesn't have to be the sole customer, but they also need to make sure that what's built will meet their needs and their requirements. And that's sometimes difficult when you're not the only customer. And so it's important that they can set the requirements properly, accurately, and that they know how the verification that they will meet those requirements are met. And that there's really clear lines of accountability and understanding of who's responsible for what. And it's something that the entire workforce needs to understand, because you have a workforce that's very talented, very capable, and also not all used to operating in that kind of mode. And so they need to understand everyone needs to understand what the roles are.
This is, like you point out, a sort of a watershed moment as NASA tries to pivot in response to national policy and the role of government versus the commercial sector. A lot has happened in the last 10 years, particularly, and it's starting to bear fruit. But it has a lot of implications and you point this out just now, the implications to the workforce. And NASA still has, roughly 12,000 scientists and engineers. As they grapple with this changing environment, what did the panel deliberate about specifically with respect to NASA's team and their role in this new era of commercial spaceflight?
Yes, that was a major focus in our recommendation relative to taking a strategic look for the future. We felt that NASA really needed to pay attention to what the workforce would be to going forward. What did they actually need in that talented workforce? They have some of the most amazing engineers, scientists, technicians. These are the people who take on a task that's supposed to be impossible and make it possible, and they take that seriously. I mean, and it's, NASA consistently is viewed as the best place to work in the federal workplace, but they need to understand what their needs are going to be going forward. Are they going to need better program managers, or system engineering will always be paramount, and NASA has written the book on system engineering, but they need to be able to not lose that expertise, because it's even more important when you're integrating components that are built by different parts of commercial and international players. And they need to develop the experience going forward, because they have a lot of talent that's going to go out to the door with retirements in the future, and the people who've been around for a long time need to be replaced, but there needs to be the right pipeline, and you don't want to go the route of saying, okay, from now on we're just going to be program managers, because then you're not good program managers. You need to retain that, so they need to have hands-on experience along the way. So the right balance of what does NASA make itself, what does NASA manage that others make, and what does it buy as a service, and have the workforce that is shaped to perform those tasks. And
Thank you.
I think it's going to be a different workforce, but a lot of the same foundation.
Very good.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
mean, obviously the workforce is changing, and NASA will continue to evolve. Let's talk a little bit about the 2010 National Space Policy that directed agencies specifically to start looking more to commercial industry and stop developing and operating government space systems. And there were a few exceptions to that, few conditions like doing something in the national interest, or if it's more cost effective, or things like that. But this policy, going back to 2010, seems to be nearer the source of NASA's acquisition strategies. And as I mentioned before, with the Artemis program, each of those elements are being kind of managed separately. There's a lot of space systems development going on with regard to the exploration program. So what might this policy imply with regard to NASA's institutional acumen in program management, systems engineering, and safety?
Yeah, this makes the job more complex, and yet there's a lot of benefits to it. Because the industry has evolved the way it is, because there are more customers for the systems, it gives you an advantage, because you don't have to be the sole customer. SpaceX developed the Falcon 9 largely with a lot of NASA seed corn, and it's the workhorse for a lot of the commercial resupply and the commercial crew program. But it's also a vehicle that's launching, performing launches for the Air Force, for other commercial ventures within the United States and internationally. And I think SpaceX is going to be launching more than 40 in the 40s of Falcon 9s in this next year. And only a fraction of those are for NASA. So NASA can take advantage of that and integrate it and other capabilities like that into their portfolio as part of the components of a bigger system like Artemis. But there are hazards in that. There are hazards in that you still have to integrate all those components, even though you don't necessarily own the designs. So you have to make sure that and it's bigger than just setting the right interface standards. There's more that has to work than just the interface standards. You also have to make sure you get the right priority. I mean, if you're not the only customer, you might not be the prime customer. And so there's things, and you've got to be careful about, for example, with taking in international partners, that are they on your critical path? When you don't necessarily have the same insight into the progress of the day-to-day progress of the development. So there's a lot of hazard that goes along with all the advantage. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, and so it's there will be safety implications. That traveling in space is never going to be safe. I mean, it's always going to be hazardous. One of the things that our panel always emphasizes is we're not about trying to tell NASA, don't launch until it's perfectly safe. It's manage that risk, understand the risk, and understand the risk value proposition. And so there's a lot of value in taking on commercial partners and international partners, and there's a risk to it, and it needs to be managed. I don't know how you see it, but that's where we're viewing.
Yeah, I think Jeff is quite familiar with managing those large programs.
Yeah, Dr. Sanders, that the timeliness of your report this year was particularly good. I think the whole community was very interested to see the findings of your report. You have a section in the report that teases out some questions on leadership, on vision, on some guiding principles that were particularly well stated. And if you could speak to a challenge or two in each of those three areas: leadership, vision, and the guiding principles.
Well, the challenges in those three.
And we've talked around. I think we've talked around a couple of them here already. In the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that NASA has great leadership. They're very fortunate in that standpoint. They've got right now they actually have three people at the top: the administrator, the deputy administrator, and the associate administrator, who've all flown in space. This is probably a first time for that, and they are all very competent people. And the tiers below them are all very competent as well. They have so much on their plate right now. There's so much going on at NASA, whether it's in the Earth sciences, whether heliophysics, there's some X-planes for the first time in a long time. There's the James Webb Telescope, which is a miracle event in itself. And then all of the Artemis and the space station continuing efforts, and having making yourself take the time to set aside for looking at things strategically, as opposed to fighting the alligators that are at the heels, is an important leadership challenge. And I see them stepping up to it. I see them stepping up to that. But the other big challenge is okay, you can set guiding principles. You can think you have set guiding principles, but how do you make those resonate? How do you make them completely understood and embraced throughout the entire workforce? And that's got multiple components. One is you want to get all the centers and center directors pulling together instead of as sort of separate little entities. It's NASA's goals first, and then how do we support them, not just what does my center want to do. But even down to there are so many decisions that are made every day at a very low level in the chain of the processes of developing and designing and executing and integrating, that everyone needs to have a good understanding of what those guiding principles are, and that communication is an important facet.
Yeah, Dr. Sanders, in the report, there was a recommendation about perhaps establishing a NASA board of directors, which might mitigate some of these cultural issues. Could be one way to do it. You think that might be a reasonable way forward? Because, I mean, just from personal experience, I worked for NASA for 7 years and also have supported NASA through most of my career. And so, the thing you said about the centers is dead on. Would something like a different structure at the top help that, do you think?
And what we were trying to get at is pretty much that. It isn't that they actually need to create a new entity. They have forums to do this, but they needed to govern like a board of directors, where the center directors and mission directors come together and work together on those guiding principles, although in the end, the guiding principle has to come from the top leadership. But that they all embrace it, and then they as acting like a board of directors, put that as their first priority, is acting on behalf of the agency as a whole. And they have to put aside some of the, if you will, parochial interests of the individual centers. A long time ago, after 1958, each center sort of had a role in the original construct that NASA played. And over time, things have evolved and changed somewhat. And yet can be an easy tendency to say, well, I still need to find the right work for my people. I need to have the right, my center needs to do this. And it's really, NASA needs to do something, and the center needs to sort out the best way to support doing what NASA needs, as well as the mission directors. There's also a component of that needs constituent support from the Congress and the individual centers, and that's sometimes difficult. But,
Dr. Sanders, of course, the ASAP is very interested in perhaps most keenly in looking at the way the agency manages risk. And we talk about it in terms of risk for safety for the astronauts, of course. But beyond that, NASA's approach to the overall mission and being able to be successful and good stewards of the taxpayer and so forth. So specifically in the era that we're in, speak about a challenge or two specifically related to the risk that you see NASA addressing, and the way that they maybe some of the areas of emphasis that they might want to focus on in order to meet those challenges.
Okay. Obviously, this is going to be a big year for NASA. They're planning to launch Artemis 1, which is the very first of the missions related to that overall moon and on to Mars program. And there will be a lot of technical objectives. There's a lot of objectives for Artemis 1 that are necessary in order to lead to Artemis 2, which is the first crewed launch of that vehicle. But I think that one of the big challenges with the whole Artemis program is getting it organized to be managed as a true program, as an integrated program. It didn't grow up that way. for a number of reasons, when that had to do with changing priorities with administrations and changing directions given to NASA. We're going to the moon and then to Mars. No, we're just going to Mars. We're not going to go back to the moon first. No, we're going to go to an asteroid. We have a constellation program. No, we don't have a constellation program. And NASA got in a mode of, well, we're building different capabilities, and hopefully with some administration, we'll be able to put these together and have a real program. So they were building an SLS and an Orion ground system, a gateway. And now they really need to reinvigorate the system engineering that they are so good at and have been so good at and been successful, key to their success in the past, and start to operate Artemis and manage it like an integrated program. And I think they're on a path to do that, but that's going to be a big challenge for them to do that level of integration with that number of different components, and that are different for the set of components will be different for every Artemis mission. And so it's, there's a lot of moving parts, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges.
So you mentioned NASA's expertise at systems engineering, and I would not argue with you on that point for 1 millisecond. But however, a lot of the commercial companies, or some of the commercial companies, don't follow the traditional systems engineering stepwise or V-type methodology. Rather, SpaceX develops rockets kind of like you write software programs. Each version is a little different than the previous one. I sensed sort of a hesitancy on the part of some of the NASA individuals with whom I work on accepting that as being a legitimate way to do things. Do you see NASA, kind of opening its aperture, if you will, about doing things differently based on some of the successes that we've seen from the commercial side?
Yeah. The commercial crew program was a big learning experience for everybody. I think, it was, you had two bookends in terms of your two potential providers there. One with very traditional system engineering experience, a lot of space experience. One that was a fledgling. It almost seemed like they were building things on the fly. They were very, very hardware rich. They built it, tested it, rebuilt it, tested it, flew it, blew it up, tested it. But they learned a lot through that, and they had different system engineering philosophies and processes, but they actually matured in ways that edged them closer to more traditional system engineering, and yet still kept a lot of innovation in the system. And it's been a good thing, and it taught NASA some lessons as well. Whereas their other provider, who was more traditional, bogged down and forgot some of those engineering principles and system engineering principles along the way, and had to relearn some of them as well. So yes, the aperture is opened quite a bit. It's not a comfortable position for some of the NASA folks who've been around for a while, but they have learned a lot. And I would think one of the goodnesses has been the openness of SpaceX and some of the other providers to actually share with NASA, and then also listen to NASA, because there were a couple of areas that SpaceX was struggling with, and NASA had the expertise to help them out. I mean, the composite overwrap pressure vehicles, material compatibilities, parachutes, and it was they drew on and they were not shy about doing it, and NASA was not shy about providing expertise. So I think everyone's learning together. And this will
make the
bode us well.
that I'm sorry. I would make the observation that SpaceX as a provider has captured a little bit of the spirit that NASA was founded on. In the early days of NASA, it was very hardware rich. They were launching many things. They were learning fast. They were on a plan to go to the moon, and had a lot of the nation behind them. And so the SpaceX team seems to have captured some of that spirit.
I would agree.
Dr. Sanders, the environment that we're in, of course, NASA doesn't live in isolation, right? And civil space even doesn't live in isolation. It lives in a broader ecosystem, if you will, across what one might call the national space enterprise. And so, do you see the lessons that you're watching NASA go through? Do you see that it actually has broader applicability to the spacefaring agencies of the federal government?
I certainly think that there's a lot of sharing that can go on between the defense sector of space and NASA as to government entities. And I also think that there's a lot that the commercial industry can still learn from NASA. There's some deep and rich heritage there that should not go untapped as they move forward. You see this in the aviation sector. NASA was, originally had a role much the same as they had in space early on, and they were a big part of developing the aviation industry. Now they are not in the same position. The aviation industry is largely on its own, and yet there's still technologies that NASA is developing in concert with them to pass on. The 2X planes that are about to be tested. One having to do with the propulsion systems, and one having to do with the low boom technology for supersonic travel. So, there's a heritage that you don't want to lose, and a leadership role, I think, that NASA will continue to have for the commercial sector.
Agreed. And indeed, there is quite a heritage of NASA in the past working with the Air Force on the early launches out of Kennedy, Cape Canaveral. And also, since the Space Force has been stood up, there's actually a memorandum of understanding between the Air Force and NASA to work together where it makes sense. And the Space Force has really pushed on this being born digital. And I know that NASA is looking at a digital transformation. In fact, I've stood up a group to start working that digital transformation. How might that play into how NASA goes forward? Can NASA kind of lean on that to make itself more efficient, or to transform itself, or even revision itself? How might that play?
Oh, I think it's got a big role for the future. I was just talking earlier to Kathleen Lueders, who runs a large portion of the Human Exploration Program, and she was noting that most of the ground system for the Artemis 1 launch is still paper-based, and that they really need to move on to the future. And it's really part of being able to have a sustainable program in the long run, and one that the nation can actually afford. And so I think that there are technologies that NASA needs to embrace as well as the commercial industry.
Dr. Sanders, the SpaceX team, of course, to kind of return to that topic for just a minute. So we see them moving forward very briskly on their Starship concept with the large booster, and their plan, of course, for the human landing system for NASA is to use some of those launches to launch propellant into space, and then sort of store it there until they have enough built up so they can send the Starship onto the moon. It's a rather different, very different approach than what NASA has traditionally pursued. And it seems to be a signal toward what might be possible more commercially in the cislunar environment, if the cislunar being defined as just in the neighborhood of the moon and in the Earth-Moon system for our viewers. So the way ahead, the future, NASA's position with respect to growing a space economy, a space-based economy, in fact, is the changes we're seeing in the acquisition approaches and the implications to not only safety but successful development and what we might call mission success. Do you see that future being bright, or still with many challenges in front of it?
Those aren't mutually exclusive. I think it's bright, and it still has many challenges. I mean, just take where they're looking for commercial low Earth orbit presence. There's going to become a time when NASA should not be the sole person having, or even with its partners. International Space Station was never NASA solely, but the government shouldn't be the sole location to go in low Earth orbit. And they're providing seed corn right now for other entities to develop, but not just for NASA to be the customer. For there to be a business base where there are other customers besides NASA, and NASA is just one of them. So NASA will continue to have a need to operate in low Earth orbit, but it doesn't have to be the place to go. And so that's one aspect. You mentioned the lander. What the design for that SpaceX has for that whole project is not based solely on NASA's needs. I mean, this idea of having essentially a gas station in space is not just so NASA can fuel a lander, but so that other entities will be able to. It's in some ways both an advantage for NASA because NASA, it's being developed and SpaceX is going to develop Starship, whether or not NASA is the sole user or not. But the whole design is predicated on more than one user, and therefore there's some risks in there that maybe NASA wouldn't have to take on if it were just for their needs. And a lot of cryogenic transfer in space, for example. But it's so dual-edged sword, but I think it's the way of the future. You're going to see more of this.
Well, we really appreciate your taking the time to join us today for the Space Policy Show. Jeff, thank you very much for taking the time. I'd like to ask both of you any closing remarks that you'd like to make before we say so long to our audience. Jeff?
Just that I think the ASAP report, as it was rolled out in January, is an important not just for NASA, but for policymakers as well. And I am hoping and praying that there are more inquiries and more requests from you, Dr. Sanders, for further exposition on the points that you were making in that report. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. We put a lot of effort and work in not just the report, it's our body of work for the year, and it just culminates it. And this year we intend to follow up on that. So yes, there'll be more. And I really appreciate the time spent with you today.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to the next report coming from your panel. I'd like to thank you for all the hard work that I know you put into this activity and all the panel members. I know it's not an easy thing to do, so thank you for that. And with that, we'll hand it back over to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders, for joining our experts today on how NASA fits into the 21st century paradigm. Our executive producer is Colleen Stover, and our technical director is James Liggins. You can find more of our shows at csps.aerospace.org, or check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow. See you next time.